Princess Elinea, whose life had been very tragic, upon finding herself again in her 3-year-old body. And she came up with a plan. She decided she no longer needed any family, and from then on Elinea's path toward independence began. The girl dedicated herself to the baking business, mines, and various other ventures. She worked constantly, without rest, to earn more. Even the father, who had always ignored his own daughter, changed his behavior. And he declared the moment Linnea called him Dad an international holiday. The story begins at the moment the stolen princess was found in a warehouse inside one of the wooden crates. Linnea throws herself into her father's arms, who apologizes for taking so long. Upon the princess finally being found, the emperor announced the end of the search and the return home. Meanwhile, the protagonist remains tied up in the crate, and for some reason, no one even thinks of looking for her. The young woman was so tired of being a supporting character in this story that tears of resentment streamed down her cheeks. One day she realized she was in a novel, and her role was nothing more than that of a minor noble character. At first, Riveler was even happy to be a very rich girl, but it turned out to be an illusion that shattered in an instant. Her father taught the girl that she must always seek knowledge. Her loyalty to the emperor knew no bounds, and she served him with all her heart. That's why Riveler didn't understand why such a loyal family to the reigning dynasty had never been mentioned in the original work. All of this happened because of the obsession Liam Curtis Rastall, the tyrannical emperor, had for his daughter. Of course, his daughter calling him Dad was a joyous event, but making a celebration out of it was quite strange. Raveler's father, Duke of Felicity, was the only one who dared to express his opinion on the matter. He couldn't understand why the emperor decided to gift his daughter a country stained with blood, thinking it was unworthy of her highness. This enraged the emperor, who accused the duke of scorning the princess. His Majesty considered it proof that the Felicity family had conspired with an enemy. By imperial order, Raveler's parents were sentenced to death for treason. The girl lost her family when she was only 7 years old. Overwhelmed by tears, she escaped the burning castle. Not only did her beloved family leave, but so did everyone connected to the Felicity family. With all her might, she fled from the pursuers through the forest, mentally lamenting that her father was precisely the one facing the tyrant. The girl lacked the strength to escape the knights and was eventually captured. At that moment, Riveler vowed to herself that she would never follow in the footsteps of her father, who was loyal to the emperor. But fate decided otherwise, and she was given a chance to escape in exchange for serving the princess. Riveler was transferred to the palace and appointed as Her Highness's personal taster to verify food and drinks in search of poisons. At first, when she was captured, the emperor's subjects stared for a long time at her pink hair and the emblem on her dress. There could be no mistakes. She was clearly the daughter of the traitorous Duke of Felicity. The knight announced that the girl's fate would be decided by the princess, and if luck was on her side, she would be sent to the mines. However, the possibility that Raveler would simply be left on the mountain of magical beasts was not ruled out. A woman who had also arrived at the dungeon advised the girl to accept any punishment with dignity. Raveler couldn't believe that a girl as fragile as her would be sent to a mine to wield a pickaxe. As for the mountain of magical beasts, not even the imperial knights returned alive from there. She didn't believe it possible for them to treat a child so cruelly, but the protagonist convinced herself to calm down and look for a way out. Gathering her thoughts, Raveler suddenly realized that the fall of the House of Felicity had not been detailed in the original story. That is, as long as she stayed as far away as possible from the princess, Raveler still had a chance to reclaim her quiet life. That meant that wherever she ended up, whether in the mine or elsewhere, hope still existed. At that moment, the girl decided to create her own happy ending outside the original story. But despite that, fate, embodied by the princess, had another plan, and Raveler became Elena's taster. When the maid, like a storm cloud over the girl, told her, the protagonist's heart stopped. She couldn't understand how everything had ended up like this. Now, Raveler would be the taster, who would sample the food for poison before an imperial family member ate it. Although many consider it a privilege, this job is very dangerous, as the taster risks their life every time. While sampling each dish of the princess's upcoming lunch, Riveler hoped with every bite that the food wasn't poisoned. Elinea entered the kitchen cheerfully, illuminating everything around her with a radiant smile. The maids were delighted with their adorable mistress and took the opportunity to talk to her. Suddenly, Elinea noticed an unfamiliar girl sitting at the table and asked the maids who she was. The maids explained that she was precisely the girl His Highness had saved from execution. Sensing the princess's interested gaze, Rabeler tried to avoid any contact with her at all costs. However, kind Elinea didn't let the girl feel alone and immediately ran towards her. She commented that Rabeler was incredibly charming and asked if she liked the food. Then, the princess reached out her hand to the girl and stated that she looked forward to spending time with her. Later, lying in her room, the protagonist couldn't understand how everything had come to that. In reality, she hadn't liked the food at all, and the dry bread she ate in prison seemed much tastier. But Riveler didn't even imagine that a single sentence from the princess about imprisoning children would cruelly change her fate so much. The current timeline coincides with the end of the first part of the novel. And after that, there will be a large time skip until Elinea grows up and events 10 years later are described. Although the protagonist roughly remembered the original story, she knew little about that period. However, she knew for certain that if she did nothing, she would die soon. In fact, Rabeler had wanted to run away since the first day she met Eileen. But living in the imperial palace was an absolute priority. Therefore, the protagonist was eager to find a way to resist poisons and not die. At that moment, she remembered that in the second part of the novel, when the princess was on the verge of death from an unknown poison, she was saved by the magical rapier flower. Rabeler decided to obtain it at all costs because many exotic plants grew in the palace, and the girl only needed to remember what it looked like. To do this, she went to the Imperial Library to look for a botanical encyclopedia. However, the librarian told her that traders had no right to touch imperial property and kicked her out. Rabeler tried to explain to the man that with that book, she could better perform her job as a taster. The Duke, who was in the library at the time, witnessed the conversation. And observing the girl, he confirmed that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Upon hearing the librarian accuse Rabeler of trying to poison the princess, he threw a heavy book in her face. The Duke threateningly ordered him to shut up. He said that if the librarian wanted to bark, he better go out on the street. The girl, trembling, watched what happened. She couldn't understand how Duke Cassius Vichelabry suddenly appeared by her side. That man was a sworn enemy of the Felicity family, a loyal dog of the imperial family. The Duke had earned a reputation as a merciless war demon. In the original story, he was the main puppet master, controlling everything from the shadows. Rabeler heard that he didn't spare even children. Therefore, very scared, she thought about how to escape him as soon as possible. When the Duke reached out his hands towards the girl, she screamed in terror. Rabeler froze when Cassius suddenly lifted her up and, after examining her carefully, concluded that she was fine. While the protagonist was trying to understand what it all meant, the librarian regained consciousness and started protesting Cassius's behavior. The man declared that even if he was a duke by birth, he had no right to treat anyone like that. Cassius hugged the girl and stared so firmly at the librarian that he immediately disappeared behind the door. Setting Rabeler down on the ground, she only thought about how to get the book now. She was already considering having to steal it, but at that moment she realized she could take advantage of the Duke's inexplicable kindness. She gathered her courage and begged for help once more, also asking him to lend her a botany book. To Railver's surprise, Cassius did not hesitate to agree and help her immediately. The protagonist explained that, as the princess's taster, she needed to know more about poisonous plants and medicinal ones. The Duke listened silently and attentively to the girl. Then he promised that his knight would deliver the necessary book to her. Railver ran to thank the Duke for his unusual kindness. She swore that one day she would repay Lord Vichelabry for his help. She curtsied again to the Duke and headed to her room. Upon leaving, Cassius asked his aide Hanan about the progress of the entrusted investigation. He informed him that, as expected, there was a traitor among the members of the Felicity family. According to him, the princess had boarded a ship bound for Postarimo, which likely prevented her from communicating with her knights. The Duke understood that this meant recovering her would not be an easy task. About 2 months ago, Cassius's army was advancing, occupying more and more territory in Postarimo, a crucial strategic point for the Allied forces. It was then that Vicella Barry received a letter from the Duke of Felicity, begging him to take care of his daughter and support her. After a brief silence, Cassius asked Hanan to bring the botanical encyclopedia to the girl. At that moment, he thought he should be kinder to Raveler, whose character, clearly, was as weak as her father's. The next day, the protagonist was working in the garden while the princess rode around. Raveler nibbled reluctantly at cakes, wondering why in these novels princesses always adored sweets. Last night, the Duke had kindly sent the girl the encyclopedia she requested. However, due to the constant flow of desserts, she had no time to read. Raveler ate so much she could barely breathe. She glared furiously at the princess, who rode carefree as if she would never get off her horse. Noticing the girl's gaze, Eileen smiled and winked at her. Raveler could only hope that these riding lessons would end soon. She focused on the knight training the princess, and his face seemed familiar. She remembered Kane Ashley, the princess's personal dog, who was in the front row when the Felicity family was attacked. Raveler furiously stabbed her fork into another cake, mentally wishing heaven would punish him. At that moment, Ashley's horse reared up, and the knight fell to the ground. The princess rushed to her subject, and he didn't hesitate to tell her how great an honor it was that she worried about him. While exchanging compliments, Raveler enjoyed the delicious taste of the meringue. Thanks to Ashley falling off his horse, the girl had extra free time. She picked up an encyclopedia and sat in the shade of a tree to search for the information she needed. Finally, Ravel found the page describing the rapier flower. This plant has 6 petals that give off a sweet aroma and is found near many trees. In the shade, it was evident that it would not be found in the palace gardens, as those trees usually have many insects, and it is rarely cultivated in the gardens. Those flowers could probably be found in the Forest of the Dead, although it was unclear why such a terrifying place existed near the protagonist's home. However, this did not scare Ravel at all, since all she had to do was find the flower. Filled with positive emotions, she jumped up, determined to do her best and be happy. It turned out that Rabel was not alone in the garden. A boy was sitting under the neighboring tree, discreetly observing her due to the girl's strange behavior. Noticing the stranger, the protagonist blushed, not knowing how long he had been watching her or who he was. She recognized the characteristic red color of the imperial family's eyes, his perfect appearance, and his old-fashioned, very outdated clothes. However, this character had never appeared in the original story, and Elinea was undoubtedly the only daughter in her family. Trying to figure it out, Rabel approached the boy and asked his name. But he turned around silently, and at that moment, the protagonist noticed that he was standing over a small bouquet of flowers next to a grave. Ravel blushed, gathered the flowers, apologized, and ran to bring new ones. Returning with another bouquet, the girl asked insecurely, whose grave was this? The stranger, with a bored expression, replied that nothing would change if she found out. Elinea was glad he finally spoke, and then the boy suddenly said that it was his parents' grave. Rabel was surprised by how cold it sounded, and thought perhaps he didn't get along with his family. At that moment, she remembered the oath she had made not to be like her father. The protagonist felt that looking at the boy, she saw her reflection, and it felt so heavy to Rabel that she turned around. With her hands clasped in prayer, she apologized to those resting in the grave for disturbing their peace. Then, suddenly, she turned around, took the stranger's hand, and pressed it against her chest. To the boy's surprise, she explained that she shared her strength with him, and from now on, only good things would happen to him. Ravel promised that this week would be calm, and the next would be filled with smiles. She said she was sure she would be so happy that even the saddest memories would disappear from her mind. The boy looked at her, surprised for a moment, then let go of her hand and asked if she herself was happy. Ravel smiled and said she would be happy, of that she was also sure. Grabbing the encyclopedia, the protagonist showed the flower to the stranger and asked if he knew it. She asked him to let her know if, by chance, he found a rapier around. Then, without even hearing his answer, Ray Belair waved her hand at him and ran off, promising to see each other again. The boy, after watching her go, held the palm she had held against his chest and wondered what her words meant. A few days later, Linnea ran to the emperor to deliver a cake. The princess had baked the cake herself in honor of Thanksgiving Day, to express her feelings to her father. The emperor stroked her head, surprised how she managed to bake. And when the father said he couldn't wait to try the cake, Linnea threw herself around his neck. Nearby, at her workplace, was Ray Belair, distressed by the fact that she still hadn't been able to find the rapier flower. No matter how hard she tried, there was no trace of the plant, nor did she manage to ask that boy, because they hadn't seen each other again since that day. It already seemed to the heroine that that flower didn't even grow in the forest of the dead. Due to the search for the rapier, Riveler hadn't slept well for several days and now felt drowsy. Suddenly, she overheard the maids commenting that from now on, before every visit from Duke Vicella Barry, they should request an audience with the princess. According to them, a new dispute had recently occurred in Postarimo. Hearing this, Ribeler thought that what she had given the Duke that day, clearly, had been useful to her. The heroine glanced at the Emperor and Elinea. Although she had no intention of taking revenge, that didn't mean she had forgiven them. Ribeler absolutely could not allow the Emperor to die a peaceful death. But suddenly, she noticed a thread of blood coming from her mouth and falling onto her white plate. Seeing it, the maid ran towards the imperial table and pushed the cake away. The knights also came running. Ray Belair lay on the floor, in her own blood, terrified of death. If only she had found that flower, none of this would have happened. A boy with red eyes, passing by, heard the commotion in the castle courtyard, and he dropped the girl's flower. Ray Belair felt unbearable pain. She couldn't breathe and, desperate, grabbed the grass beneath her. Duke Cassius approached, lifted her head from the ground, called her by name. And seeing him, she cried, thinking he was her father. She remembered that her father told her not to repress negative emotions and simply let them go. He explained to her that she shouldn't cling to offenses or regrets. If there was something terrible she couldn't overcome, she just had to smile and it would be easier. Then, Ribeler didn't understand why her father had told her something so complicated. And she didn't realize his true intentions. Later she learned that the Duke wished nothing more than for his daughter to forget everything and find happiness. The protagonist wept inconsolably, clinging to the shadows of her parents and begging them to return, asserting that she had been wrong. If only she had been more careful and her memory had returned sooner, now Ribeler wasn't sure if she could forget and forgive. A butterfly with magical and luminous wings flew over the imperial castle. After circling the area, it entered directly through Ribeler's window. A boy was next to the protagonist's bed, holding a bouquet of Rapunzel flowers, listening to her calling for her father in delirium. A week later, Ribeler finally regained consciousness, although it felt like she was dying. The protagonist couldn't imagine that the Duke would help her again and even assign her a separate room. She was sitting on the bed when Hannon entered, and then Riveler understood why Cassius had helped her. He came to the castle that day because he personally wanted to find out where the girl got the information from. That information included secret correspondence between the deceased emperor and the former Duke of Vicellabernio. The letters were hidden among the belongings of the former ruler. Hannon asked Riveler if she knew anything else, since thanks to her, they had recovered the lands the emperor had taken. However, the protagonist stated that she only knew what her father had told her. She apologized, but Hannon stressed that they greatly valued her contribution and left the room. The last incident made Riveler realize that her life might depend on something as insignificant as a plant. And in such a situation, she couldn't collaborate with a manipulator like Bicella Berry. However, the female protagonist's conscience did not leave her at ease. Those men had saved her, and she refused to return the favor. Riebler tried to push those thoughts from her mind, convincing herself that she couldn't be that naive. The most important thing was for her to concentrate on her own survival. At that moment, the protagonist perceived the sweet scent of flowers on her bedside table. She got off the bed and approached to confirm they were Rapunzel flowers. Although Riebler didn't remember how the boy managed to reach her and fed her petals to heal her, the girl was sure that he was the one who left them. Now she owed him a lot and decided they had to meet. She decided to write a letter to the boy. Riebler drafted a note that, in her opinion, should force him to come see her. She folded the letter into a small origami boat and ran to leave it by the grave. The girl decided she would deal with the Duke later, when the door to her room opened. In the doorway, with a basket in her hand, stood the princess, who was delighted to see Riebler awake. While Linnea overwhelmed the protagonist with questions about her condition, she tried to figure out why she was there and how she knew her. Riebler didn't have time to answer when the princess rushed towards her. She began to examine her to check if she had a fever and if she was ready to get up. Suddenly, Elena's eyes filled with tears, and she began to apologize to the heroine. According to her, she would never have forced Relera to do such a thing. The heroine didn't understand why the princess acted as if she had known her for a long time. Grabbing the astonished girl's hand, Elena suddenly proposed that she become her lady-in-waiting. Although Ryler tried to protest, remembering she was a taster, the princess suggested abandoning that dangerous job. The idea of becoming Elena's lady-in-waiting horrified the heroine, whose tyrannical father could execute anyone without reason. The princess allowed her to decide later, and Ryler thanked her for her interest. For Elena, on the other hand, there was nothing supernatural about it, and she was glad to be able to talk with the girl for so long for the first time. The heroine was so surprised by the princess's incredible communication skills that she couldn't utter a word. However, at that moment, Elena was interrupted and urgently asked to come over. It turned out that the knights who went hunting magical beasts had returned. The princess promised Rayler to see her later and was about to leave, but at that instant, she saw the flowers on the nightstand and admired their beauty. The heroine stood still in her curtsy and noticed her heart starting to beat faster. When asking Elena where she had gathered those flowers, Rayler replied that she had found them nearby. The princess mentioned that she loved purple flowers, as her father had gifted her purple peony petals for the first time. She suddenly turned to Rabelair and asked her to hand over those flowers. At that moment, the protagonist understood that everything wasn't going as well as it seemed at first. Clutching the hem of her dress, she allowed the princess to take the flowers. But inside her, everything boiled with indignation. In the end, after a few days, Rabelair only had one bouquet left. Elena visited her room frequently and asked for small portions. One night she even refused to wake her up and simply took the flowers, leaving a note. She only had one rapier left, so she had to get another as quickly as possible. The problem was that she didn't know if that boy had found the note, and she couldn't just wait around doing nothing. Rabelair decided to go check if the letter was still there, but upon stepping into the hallway, she found absolute chaos. Wounded everywhere, none of them had even received first aid due to the prolonged fight. The servants were leaning over one of them and whispering among themselves that he wouldn't survive more than 3 hours without help from a mage or a priest. Realizing she couldn't sneak out unnoticed, Ravalier decided to try escaping through her room window. However, the servants' conversation forced her to stay. The man wounded by a magical beast was a commoner, so no one was rushing to help him. Hearing this, Ravalier slipped out from behind the door and approached the boy. She knew the poison from the bite would soon reach his heart, and that the rapier flower she had left could save him. In reality, she didn't want to do it too much. The image of her sitting at the table, tasting cakes, flashed through the protagonist's mind, with stains of her own blood in the background. Although she had carried the last flower with her the whole time, so it wouldn't be stolen. The girl plucked off a petal anyway. Although the rapier flower withers very slowly, when it does, it loses its healing properties. Knowing the flower only had 2 days left, Raveler offered him the petal and told him to eat it to stop the poison. He slightly parted his dry lips, and the girl placed the plant in his mouth. To give away such a flower is like sharing your own life. Raveler asked him to repay her in kind someday. She sighed, hoping he would survive, and returned to her room. She managed to leave the castle and only returned after 6 hours. The girl was very tired, but understood it was worth it. Although she didn't manage to meet that boy, there was no note on the grave. Moreover, Raveler managed to keep the princess's last flower. And when the princess came to see her, the protagonist said that insects had eaten it. She threw herself onto the bed to rest well. Suddenly, the balcony door burst wide open, and the girl heard someone behind her. Turning around, she saw a boy with red eyes and was overjoyed at his arrival. However, he, without even greeting her, quickly approached Raveler, pressed her back against the headboard, and demanded she explain what secret about him she knew. The protagonist understood that he had found the letter and was so happy to see him that she didn't even notice his strange behavior. The boy mentally reviewed the letter, in which Raveler had written that she knew his secret, and she would reveal it in person. When he finally understood that she had only tricked him, the protagonist apologized. She clung to him and explained why she had done it. Although he tried to pull away, she held him tightly and begged him not to leave. Raveler promised to let him go if he listened to her request. She pointed out that she had to carefully guard the life he had saved her, and thanked him again. The protagonist was convinced that she had only survived thanks to him. That's why she wanted to thank him personally. Taking the opportunity, Raveler asked him where he had gotten those flowers. She explained that the ones he brought last time were already withered. The boy promised to explain if Raveler let him go. She agreed, but only on the condition that he give her his hand to be sure he wouldn't run away. The boy understood that resisting was useless, and the heroine dragged him along. Leaving the castle, he walked with a firm step, leading the girl through the forest they both knew. At one point, Raveler stopped to catch her breath, but it turned out they had already arrived. Without letting go of the boy's hand, the heroine looked up and observed her surroundings. They were in a clearing covered with monkshood flowers. Excited by the quantity of magical flowers, Raveler ran to hug him and called him her guardian angel. And since he had saved the life that everyone had ignored, the heroine promised to protect him from then on. The girl raised her hand towards his face and asked him to wait for her, promising that next time she would go to him. As she brushed his cheek, she added that she hoped when the time came, His Highness would tell her his real name. His eyes showed clear surprise. He asked how she knew, but Raveler only smiled. The heroine asked him if he needed anything to let her know, since he had helped her knowing where she came from. After a week of rest, Raveler returned to her job. Tasting the cakes placed on the table, she tried to understand why there was so much noise in the palace. Maids were running around the castle, ordering and distributing boxes with gifts everywhere. The girl understood from their words that they were preparing rewards for the townspeople who had recently hunted magical creatures. She didn't doubt that giving the last rapier flower to that wounded man was the right decision. Anyway, she managed to find more. And since then, she eats a petal in the morning just in case. She keeps several spares. And now, she no longer worries about her life. Raveler was examining another dish when the princess burst into the banquet hall shouting. She immediately ran towards the protagonist, expressing her joy at her return. Raveler didn't know how to react to such an intense display of emotion. So she stammered in response that she was also happy to see Elinea. The princess threw herself to hug the girl, despite the maid's comment that she had to eat first, and then distribute the gifts. The protagonist was uncomfortable with Elena's hug and mentally prayed for her to let go soon. Finally, the princess let go of Raveler and asked why she was still checking the food for poisons. Elinea didn't understand why the girl refused the proposal to become her lady-in-waiting. And although Raveler didn't really want to, she stated that she liked her job protecting the princess. The The maids listened attentively when the girl said she would be happy doing it if she could thus redeem herself for her sins. The protagonist put on a sweet and naive expression and begged the princess to listen to her request. Before she finished speaking, Elinea declared that from now on they would be friends. A maid pulled the princess away and reminded her that Ray Bel-Air's family was planning an uprising. But Elinea would love to be friends with the girl who poisoned her and thus saved her life. Then, to the protagonist's astonishment, the maid suddenly asserted that if the princess wished it, the emperor probably wouldn't deny his daughter's request. Elinea enthusiastically took her new friend's hand, completely failing to realize that the latter didn't like the idea at all. She thought about how much longer this world would make her suffer. But out loud, she only thanked the princess for her kindness. To the north, in the Forest of the Dead, was the former castle of Koharu. A boy with red eyes sat on the windowsill. One after another, Raveler's memories surfaced in his mind. He reflected on his promise to become her guardian angel and defend her. He surprised himself thinking he was looking forward to the moment she would finally come to him. Meanwhile, in the castle, Rabeler spent more and more time with the princess. And now they even ate together. The protagonist was already tired of constantly eating sweets, but she feared refusing Elinea anything. So she pretended to like everything. It turned out that the culprit was the maid Raniel, who had told the princess that Rabeler adored meringue. But the protagonist had no other choice, so she kept swallowing those hated sweets. Now they even served her tea, and generally, working as a taster became easier. Since then, Rabeler no longer had to taste everything presented, only what the princess gave her. Even so, the protagonist couldn't get used to being treated so carefully. Suddenly, Rabeler noticed Toteria leaves on her plate, about which she had read in the encyclopedia. It is a medicinal plant that supposedly purifies the blood, but if consumed by a child under 10 years old, it can cause stomach aches. The protagonist decided to ask the maid if she had correctly observed that the dish contained Toteria leaves. The maid stepped back a few paces, perplexed because Rabeler had thought their stomachs couldn't digest that plant. The girl smiled and explained that she had read about it in the encyclopedia to serve as the princess's useful taster. Raniel sent the maid Julia to confirm the dish's contents and call the chef. But when he appeared, he indignantly stated that those leaves had no such effects, and that they were used to enhance the flavor. However, the maid confirmed that in all versions those properties were mentioned, and that the princess could be in danger. Rabeler felt the cook's inquisitive gaze, although in reality he was the one to blame. Raniel asked the chef to be more careful in the future, and he apologized, fearing being fired. Elinea ran to happily hug her new friend, who had saved her life once again. Rabeler noticed that the maids were looking at her strangely, as if they had suddenly changed their opinion of her. But the only thing she truly desired at that moment was for the princess to finally let her go. When the protagonist finally managed to escape, she headed towards the noble wing of the palace. Thanks to the maid's efforts, her work finished early, and she managed to get here on time. Rabeler intended to say goodbye to Duke Vichelabry and wrote him a letter. After long deliberations, she decided to repay the Duke for his kindness. The protagonist was sure that this way her debt to him would be cancelled. However, passing through one of the halls, Rabeler heard them talking about the Duke. Peeking in, the young woman saw several aristocrats discussing Vichelabry's refusal to comply with the imperial mandate. In their opinion, the war for the princess should end immediately. Rabeler remembered that in the second part of the novel, it was said that the Duke had spent 10 years preparing for the uprising in the battle. If the goal of the war in Postarimo was not the uprising at all, it meant that Vichelabry had not yet decided to rebel. The protagonist remembered how the Duke had said he decided to fight for the throne, because the war had tired him and he wanted to have fun. Although the book claimed that Cassius had indeed started the rebellion for such a trivial reason, it seemed to Rabeler that he was not such a person at all. She had heard that during the previous war, the Duke had fought without sparing himself until the end. It seemed to the young woman that there must be another reason for the uprising. Perhaps the emperor was the first to attack, since by annihilating Vichalabari, the last threat to the throne would disappear. And with the fall of the Felicity family, the imperial family would regain absolute power. If everything had really been like that, Ravelin probably wouldn't have been able to influence anything. However, she didn't lose hope that Vichalabari could still win. After all, if the Duke's son decided to fight, no one could stop him. She is talking about the other protagonist of the novel, Rowan Vichalabari. He is the Yander boy who killed his cruel father, who had mistreated him for years, and then dedicated his life completely to the princess. Even if Ravelin had told about the imperial family's betrayal, it wouldn't have mattered if Rowan had killed his father, like in the original story. So the protagonist decided to act differently. Approaching Cassius's carriage, she apologized mentally to him and whispered that she prayed for the Duke's success in the war. Then, the girl knocked on the carriage window and slipped her letter under the door. In it, she thanked the Duke for his care, and finally added that he should be careful with the servants, since her father said the bearded man looked suspicious. Cassius, who needed support at that moment, smiled, which surprised Hanan. Putting the note in his pocket, the Duke asked his aide to find a way to arrange a personal meeting with the girl. It was a sunny and clear day, and the princess was enjoying that day in the company of her father Israel. Elinea insisted again and again to her friend to eat more cake. She insisted that the girl was too thin and needed to eat better. He observed the scene for a moment and remembered his daughter, who was also there. He said this with a hint of malice, which made Lena apologize immediately, and explained that she worried a lot about Ribbler. The emperor stroked his daughter's head and declared that she should think of herself and not forget to eat. Completely without thinking about the consequences, Elinea suddenly asserted that lately she had been trying to get Riebler's attention. The protagonist tensed, expecting the emperor's anger. But the princess immediately started telling her father about the incident with the Toteria leaves. She took her hand, admiring her intelligence, since without Riebler a catastrophe could have occurred. The protagonist looked down and thanked Elinea, who since then had spent much more time with her. One day, she even brought the imperial code of laws with her during a picnic. It seemed to her that Riebler was pretending not to know anything about the laws. The protagonist blushed with embarrassment, but calmed down, thinking that it is the role of supporting characters to be foolish. However, Elinea, completely oblivious to this, announced that she would teach her everything, since her friend was intelligent. And she would remember everything quickly. The emperor silently watched Ribbler, who felt uncomfortable under his intense gaze. Then he turned to his daughter and asked about the tea ceremony she was organizing. Remembering that she still had a lot to prepare, Elinea hugged her father. Then she said goodbye to him until dinner and ran off to attend to her business. Rabelar sighed in relief when she saw that everything was over and started getting ready too. However, she soon realized that she had rejoiced prematurely, as the emperor suddenly addressed her. With his arms firmly crossed, he accused her of being a happiness traitor. Then he demanded that she remember that Vichalabari posed a threat to the one who saved Rabelier's life. The emperor warned that if anything happened to his daughter, she would face a much more horrible fate. The protagonist curtsied and stated that she would engrave his words in her heart. Although every encounter with the emperor weakened her resolve, she had no intention of forgiving her family's old enemy. The days leading up to the princess's first tea were intensely tense. Every day the protagonist went to the kitchen to inspect all the ingredients and taste every dish. In her free time, Ravelier helped the maids and still had to memorize the guest list. She still hadn't realized that the day of the tea ceremony had arrived. The mothers of the invited children, seeing the daughter of happiness at the reception, muttered about her fate. They thought she seemed quite relaxed and was too young to understand what it meant to go through something like this. Ravelier, however, was completely exhausted by the time the ceremony began. She understood that accepting the task voluntarily had been a mistake, just to get away from the princess. Finally, the evening's protagonist appeared on the scene, illuminating everyone present with her smile. The guests enthusiastically welcomed the princess's arrival. Elinea raised her glass, greeted everyone, and wished them a pleasant evening. However, not everything was perfect, as among the guests there were small children behaving badly and throwing hysterical cries. Ribbler continued serving the tables of the older guests with unflappable calm. The boys she had served cakes to wish to change places, to move away from the hubbub, and approach the princess. They wanted to listen to Elena's stories, not the shrieks of spoiled children. The boys were annoyed to have to sit still and eat the food served by the servants. Ribbler tried her best to remain calm and endure all of it. Although it was already difficult enough for her, these children projected their frustration onto her. Deep down in her soul, she wished to abandon everything. But she decided to address the uproar caused by the children first. Riviere was already heading towards them, fists clenched. But suddenly, a commotion at the princess's table stopped her. Mrs. Brown asserted that, in her opinion, Mrs. Jacqueline's words about the princess sounded offensive. But Elinea, with a disapproving gesture, asked her if she realized what she was doing. Mrs. Brown was moved by the princess's reaction to her attempt to show interest. However, Elaine insisted that she herself should decide if Mrs. Jacqueline's words had offended her. The girl stood still, not knowing what to answer, as she had defended the princess in good faith. Watching the scene, Riebler thought how regrettable it was of Mrs. Brown to act against Elena's best friend. Mrs. Jacqueline was an aristocrat who reconciled with her family thanks to the princess. Although she had only recently returned to the ranks of the aristocracy, she would soon become a key figure who would dominate high society in the novel. The same cannot be said for Mrs. Brown, who clearly did it to get closer to the princess. Due to her immaturity, she committed an imprudent action. But Aline should not have been so severe with her. The children's screams, unable to share their toys, interrupted the protagonist's thoughts. Riviere approached the children and proposed that those who wanted to play with dolls raise their hands. Taking some plastic figures, she organized a puppet show for the little ones. She chose as the story a romance between a prince and a princess who overcame many obstacles together. The children watched the show with enthusiasm and curiosity. With shining eyes, Riebler told them the story, where in the end everyone lived happily. In content, the other guests also became interested in the show and listened attentively to the girl's story. The children asked for another story, and with a smile, the protagonist began a new one, wondering where the servants who should have taken care of that were. In reality, she didn't want to draw extra attention, as before the tea party. Raniel warned her to restrain herself, as the aristocrats were very interested in her. But in the end, she had to do someone else's job. She began to tell the next story, this time about dragons. But in her mind, she thought that this event, perhaps, was not suitable for children. A few days later, Raniel called Ravel and stated that the children who attended the tea party were very grateful to her. The butler told the girl to collect the gifts they sent as a token of appreciation. Ravel, who thought these gifts were for the princess, asked if she could really collect them. In response, Raniel advised her to simply take the boxes and thank the children. Because, according to her, only thanks to Ravel did the guests enjoy the tea party. The protagonist obeyed and bowed her head to thank the butler. As she was leaving the office, Raniel suddenly stopped her and asked if she had offended the Imperial Knights. The girl stopped and looked surprised at the head butler. According to her, the Imperial Knights were looking for a child from the hospital where Ravel was seen. They looked quite angry. That's why Raniel wanted to make sure the girl knew nothing about it. Upon hearing this, the protagonist dropped the boxes with the gifts. The waitress looked at her intently. It was easy for Ray Baller to recover. And apologizing, she assured that she hadn't seen anything and couldn't help at all. The girl returned to her room and, without strength, knelt by her bed. A chill ran down her spine as she thought about why the knights were looking for her and why they seemed angry. It was nothing more than sharing a leaf of the rapier with the wounded man, hoping he would survive. Ray Veller suddenly imagined that the boy had died, and the knights who had seen her next to him began to accuse her of it. Panic overwhelmed her at the thought that now she would be suspected of the knight's death. The girl paced back and forth in the room, restless with worry. She could clear up the situation by revealing the truth about the flower. But that involved the appearance of a new poison that the rapier would no longer save her from. However, she was afraid to imagine what might happen if the misunderstanding was not cleared up. So she could only hope for the best, as during the investigation, it would be confirmed that the rapier was not a toxic plant. The protagonist wrapped herself in a blanket. She needed to rest a bit. She decided not to leave the castle unnecessarily and to avoid the nights as much as possible. Ray Belair only regretted not being able to meet that boy whom she had promised to visit. And although the protagonist had decided to avoid the nights as much as possible, the next day she ran into the captain. He looked sternly at Raveler and asked if she had really given the medicine to Knight Eden. Dominic Carlson was a distinguished imperial knight who had dedicated himself to serving the princess. The protagonist couldn't believe she had run into him specifically, since during the tasting he looked at her strangely, which made her suspect something immediately. She had no escape, and the girl admitted that she had indeed given the medicine to Eden. Although she lied a little about its origin, she said it was a secret remedy of the Felicity family, a universal antidote created by their wise relative, Torbis Lurin. Carlson trusted her, as all the pharmacy handled by the Felicity family's commercial company was high quality. He apologized for scaring her and asked her to calm down, as he didn't intend to accuse her of anything. The captain of the knights suddenly knelt before Raveler on one knee. He admitted that he should have gotten straight to the point from the beginning and thanked her from the start for saving Knight Eden. The protagonist was shocked that someone like him knelt before her. It turned out there was a small misunderstanding, and Eden was not looking for the one who tried to kill him, but the one who saved his life. Carlson patted Raveler's head with approval and thanked her again for saving the knight. And again, the protagonist experienced that strange feeling, as if something was trembling in her chest. Bending over her, the captain asked her to inform him if she needed anything. And he promised to help her in any way he could. Rayler thought she really shouldn't get involved anymore. There is nothing good in getting involved with novel characters. However, the memory of the promise made to the boy with red eyes did not leave the girl at ease. So she stopped Carlson and, clutching his cloak, said she wanted to ask him a favor. When the captain turned around, Rayler asked permission to meet the Grand Duke. When the heroine decided to take the risk, she didn't even imagine that Carlson would actually agree. A few days later, she was already in the forest, waiting for her personal guard, assigned by the captain. He warned her that the Emperor looks at the Duke with distrust, and that, if anything happens, not even Carlson will let it go. Ryler tried to push away negative thoughts. At that instant, footsteps were heard behind her, and an unknown voice greeted the girl. When she turned around, she was extremely surprised. In front of her was the knight she had saved, who introduced himself as Iriel Eden of the First Order, and said he had been entrusted to protect her that night. The boy looked so different that Rayler had trouble recognizing him immediately. Iriel thanked the girl for saving him, and apologizing in advance, easily lifted her into his arms. Since the path to the mountains was too dangerous, the knight was appointed Rayler's escort. He decided to carry her in his arms, apologizing for the delay and explaining that, after a long illness, his legs had become slower. Rabel became uneasy, but he hurried to reassure her, saying that everything was fine now, only that he had lost a little stamina. However, the heroine pointed out that he should not strain himself too much. After all, they had been given a second chance. Eden laughed and observed that he would remember it forever. However, Rabel considered the joke inappropriate. The boy might not see her again, and he needed to take care of himself. Since the knight didn't understand why she thought that, the girl reminded him that it was the princess's tasting. And furthermore, she belonged to the Felicity family. Suddenly, Eden stared intently at Rebel and, reaching out his hand, tidied a strand of her hair. After that, he suddenly asked if she perhaps wanted to leave the imperial palace. The heroine felt it could be a loyalty test. So she firmly told him that she liked everything and would continue serving Her Highness. When Rebel asserted that she wanted to repay the princess's kindness, the knight only smiled. As expected of the First Order, it is composed entirely of Lena fanatics. But the heroine couldn't even imagine that they would surprise her like this. But Eden suddenly added that if Ravel needed his help, she could turn to him. Finally, the tall gates appeared between the trees, and the knight reported that they had arrived. The heroine looked with surprise at the Grand Duke's dark castle. Raver had always wondered why the imperial palace was located near the forest of the dead. And now it seemed to her that all of this was to hide this castle. Eden reminded the girl of the captain's words, according to which no one could talk about this place. His words that there were always outside eyes and ears nearby led Raver to think that someone was watching them. The knight promised to wait for her at the entrance, and she headed towards the interior of the castle. The layer of dust on the railings clearly indicated that the place was abandoned. And no one took care of it. The longer the protagonist reflected on it, the stranger everything seemed to her. She didn't understand why the emperor had imprisoned the Grand Duke and left such a problematic figure alive. In the original story, the Duke was only mentioned once, as Liam killed all his siblings. And sisters imprisoned the nephew and took the throne himself. After that, Eileen was called the emperor's only surviving relative. And it was logical to assume that the nephew had died. But Raver knew he was still alive, and the only reason was that he remained useful to Liam. The protagonist found him by the window from which he used to look at the forest. He turned when he heard the footsteps and asked the girl why she was there. Raver smiled and replied that, as promised, she had come to learn his name. The emperor, unlike his nephew, the Grand Duke, had no legitimacy, as he was a usurper who had snatched power. Due to the lack of legitimacy, he had many enemies who wished to overthrow him. On the other hand, there was the Grand Duke, son of the former crown prince. And precisely, he was the sole legitimate heir to the throne. The cunning emperor took advantage of that. They had to find the Grand Duke first to challenge his authority. That's why they allowed him to walk freely around the palace, using his son as bait to attract traitors. The boy looked at Rivel and asked why she wanted to know his name. Rivel replied that she wanted to be his friend, but the Duke walked away and ordered her to leave. And never approach him again. Rivel understood that his caution was understandable, since both were the most hated children by the emperor. She promised not to return if she bothered him, but confessed that she didn't want to lose the opportunity to talk to him. Reflecting on it, Rivel changed the formal tone with the Duke to a friendly one. She asked, albeit somewhat late, to be able to introduce herself properly. The girl gave her name and said she liked reading books of different genres. According to Rivel, her favorite book is the biography of the adventurer Kevin. One day she would like to board a great ship and embark, like Kevin, on a grand journey. The Duke called that illusion absurd, since he could never get away from there. But the heroine didn't give up, and declared that she planned to leave and not return once she had served the princess enough. The boy reacted ironically to her words, but Ray Bel Air reminded him that she intended to be happy. Just like him. Although the Duke considered it absurd, the girl asserted that she would help him achieve it. That's why she asked him to let her know when he finally started trusting her. Then she whispered in his ear that she would show him the path to happiness. While Ray Beller ran after the Duke, who was descending the stairs with questions about their next meeting. Someone above was watching them. The man in the cloak noticed that Felicity and the Duke had clearly grown closer. Casting a look in their direction, he suggested in a low voice to finish off the girl. From his office, the Emperor observed everything through a magic sphere, with his eyes fixed on them. He ordered that Reveler not be touched, since his daughter favored that girl. In fact, all this deeply irritated the Emperor. However, Liam was sure that he still had time to devise how to eliminate them both. Elling's professor was amazed by her work and compared it to a historical discovery. The princess modestly replied that the professor was exaggerating. Nevertheless, the man considered that this work could be sent to a conference. Ray Bell listened with what enthusiasm the professor offered to help the princess prepare her presentation. She found it entertaining to see how the plot development of the original story had changed. In that story, the glory for the discovery was supposed to belong to him. The class came to an end, and the professor said goodbye to his student. The maids offered the tired Elaine a snack. Ravel was uneasy that the amount of poisoned food had considerably increased lately. Eileen approached the girl who had been sewing silently by the window. She invited Ravel to join her classes and, taking her by the hand, dragged her along. The protagonist wasn't very keen, as it was difficult to pretend she knew nothing. But the princess was inflexible in her desire to learn alongside Ravel. Raniel, leaning towards Aline, began to admire her intelligence. Then she added that, no matter how smart Rabel was, it would be difficult for her to compete with the princess. The protagonist supported the maid, as Aline had even made a historical discovery. And she could not compare to her. Since the princess was worried about who had poisoned Rabel, Raniel hurried to reassure her. According to her, the emperor had taken the case under his control and would find the culprit. The heroine doubted this, as in the original story, the true identity of the culprit was only revealed 10 years later. Her goal was to snatch the emperor's family at the happiest moment of his life. That meant that, for now, she was only experimenting with poisons and was not yet planning to actually kill the princess. The maid brought fruit to the table for Raveler, which deeply surprised Elinea. However, the girl claimed that she liked everything and took a whole handful. For some reason, the fruits looked much more expensive than usual. And even Riebler didn't understand why they had ended up in hands like hers. Nevertheless, upon seeing the maid's reaction, the bitten apple fell from her hand. Elinea, for her part, was extraordinarily happy about the fact that the girl had made friends with everyone. But this atmosphere deeply irritated Riebler. Lying on the bed, she complained about how attitudes towards her changed according to the princess's mood. The girl turned to the duke sitting next to her and asked what he thought about it. He didn't understand why she was asking him and asked her not to interrupt his reading. Ignoring his request, Raveler suggested to the duke that they look at the book she had left in the adjoining room. It was actually just a pretext, because in one of them she had left a message about the only way for the duke to survive. The boy supposed that those books were probably about adventures or travels. Rahavler couldn't understand how the idea of the immense blue expanse of the sea and the light breeze couldn't be exciting. She demanded that he promise to read those books without fail. The duke leaned back on the pillows and, with a bored expression, asked Rahavler to leave. Since he was tired, he threw the book on the floor, and the protagonist found it hard to understand how he could get tired after reading for only half an hour. As she left, she reminded him once again to read what she had brought. Rahavler looked at the duke. He was lying down, turning his back to her, and didn't even say goodbye to her. Still, understanding that she felt calmer there than anywhere else. The protagonist decided to stay a little longer. A few days later, the princess went out boating with her friends. She decided to introduce Rahavler to the girls, who wanted to know more about her. The protagonist was sitting at the table, feeling uncomfortable. The princess's friends curiously observed her personal taster, who had impressed everyone at the tea gathering. Donna couldn't believe how well Rivler got along with people, especially since she herself had had an argument with Mrs. Brown. Michelle Talia, daughter of the powerful Marquis, became angry when she saw her friend mention that topic again. In her opinion, talking to someone like Brown could tarnish her honor. Elinea also thought that she didn't blame Dawn for anything, and all the fault lay only with her opponent. Michelle declared that she wanted revenge on Brown, but her family's business collapsed. So they had already suffered punishment. According to her, it was evident that the emperor valued his daughter highly. Elinea cried out in surprise when she learned that her friends thought her father had something to do with it. But her surprise soon turned into embarrassment and pride towards her father, which greatly frightened Rivler. She couldn't understand how normal people could talk so cheerfully about someone's disaster. Monica suddenly reported that she had heard news about Prince Vicella Barry. Elinea felt relieved to learn that everything was fine and that he had recently started learning to manage his lands. The girls were even surprised by the princess's intense reaction to the news. But then, Mitchell also told them that the soldiers sent to the war in Rubindisi, Duke Vicelabri's lands, had already returned. They were supposed to send the Duke back to the campaign, but he refused to obey. The girls were angry at his refusal, and only Riveler understood how much blood could be spilled in that war. However, the protagonist tried to push away the thought that her interlocutors had no inclination towards compassion. Observing the calm surface of the lake, Riveler reflected on how much she would like to visit the sea. Watch the fish swim peacefully around her. And she thought it would be wonderful if this lake were connected to the sea. Suddenly, a loud splash was heard, and stones began to fall into the lake from the shore. The maid checked that the girls were okay, and, for security reasons, they decided to return to land urgently. Although Riveler didn't understand what had happened, for some reason she felt guilty. Since the outing had to end due to the collapse, the girls decided to have a picnic to cheer up. The protagonist was eager for everything to end quickly. It was terrifying to imagine how many times she had eaten poisoned food in one day. Suddenly, the princess turned to Riveler and asked if she had offended her in any way. It seemed to her that the girl hadn't liked her conversation about victualabry. But the protagonist was quick to assure Elinea otherwise. Embarrassed by how openly the princess mentioned it, Riveler asserted that she had no contact with the Duke. She tried to justify her gloomy mood by saying she was tired from so much delicious food. Upon hearing about delicious food, the princess suddenly proposed that Riveler go to the festival together. Although the protagonist didn't like the idea at all, she tried to feign enthusiasm. Elinea promised her friends to go together and hurried to confirm that they had no objection to taking Riveler. However, the protagonist remembered that in the original story, the visit to the festival was related to the episode of the princess's kidnapping. She, as a supporting character, could get into trouble and die. Riveler knew that she had to refuse under no circumstances, but the princess was too excited. It became evident that refusing would not be possible. So all the girls dressed up and headed to the festival. The possibility of a kidnapping kept filling Riveler's mind, but Elinea greatly enjoyed their outing. Taking the girl's hand, she suggested they watch the circus while waiting for the others. Since it was safer than wandering aimlessly, the protagonist obediently followed her. However, so many people gathered at the circus that Riveler lost sight of Elinea. The protagonist was nearly trampled, but managed to escape the crowd. Only now did she find out that she had lost the princess. Riveler became furious at how everything had turned out. The sun was already beginning to set, and the protagonist hadn't had time to find anyone from her team. She couldn't process the idea that perhaps Elinea hadn't noticed her disappearance. Nor had she rushed to look for her. Riveler understood that wandering around was not a good idea. So she decided to stay still in one place until everyone gathered. At that moment, she noticed two children on the sides who had lost their mother and were very upset by the event. The protagonist tried to calm them down and indicated where the children could turn to security staff. Seeing their tearful eyes, Riveler offered her help. The children explained that their mother had told them to stay put if they got lost. Although they were right, Riveler knew that if they went to the guards, their parents would find them faster. After thinking for a bit, the girl decided to take charge of making the children feel safe. So she approached them and proposed telling a story while they waited for their mother. While Riveler was telling a fairy tale about a princess, Elinea appeared from the corner. Her friends were surprised again by how well the girl managed to connect with people. However, Elinea for some reason did not share her enthusiasm and watched her in silence, as if she were annoyed. Michelle reprimanded Donna, considering that she should not speak ill of a traitor in front of the princess. However, Elinea suddenly turned around, and as if nothing had happened, stated that Riveler was truly a very good girl. The scene suddenly shifted to other, more adult memories of the princess, in which she addressed her friend. She asks her why Riveler, no matter what happens, always remains kind, since she herself never knew how to do it. The mother of the lost children finally appeared, and after thanking Riveler, she said goodbye to her. The city was already plunged into darkness, and the girl didn't understand why no one had come looking for her. Until now, she hadn't approached the guard so as not to betray the princess, and she was about to do so when suddenly footsteps were heard nearby. Elinea, feigning concern, ran to Rablier and told her that she had accompanied a friend home. The protagonist asked the princess if she was too tired. It didn't escape her notice that the princess seemed somewhat depressed. Suddenly, Elinea proposed that they go to the Flower Lantern Festival. Even though it was midnight, she grabbed her hand. Regretting not having been able to spend time together, the princess proposed buying flower lanterns and taking them with them. Ravalier followed her obediently, hoping the imperial knights were nearby. And everything was fine. Approaching the shop, Elinea asked the saleswoman to give them 2 lanterns. The protagonist, although smiling, was very tense. Meanwhile, the girl in the blood-stained cloak reported via a magic ring that the knights had been destroyed. In response, she received the order to capture the princess. It seemed to Ravalier that she heard something strange. A chill ran down her spine, but Elinea didn't notice. She showed the girl the lake covered with flower lanterns, and for a while they admired its beauty with amazement. The princess asked Ravel if she liked these flowers. The girl observed that they had the same color as Elena's eyes. The princess whispered that Ravel was very kind, but she didn't hear her words. And suddenly, Elinea confessed that she had known the girl for a long time. But when the protagonist asked her what she meant, the princess replied that many interesting things were heard in the palace. And everyone said that Ravel was intelligent and capable of anything. Elinea was amused by the girl's expression at that moment. She told her that she had started admiring her some time ago. According to the princess, by her mere existence, Ravel brings joy to people. The protagonist understood that Elinea was trying to say something, but she didn't understand what. Nevertheless, she noticed that the princess's mood had improved, and that was the main thing. But suddenly, a man in a black cloak appeared behind Elinea, and now it was clear to Ravel where that feeling of danger that hadn't left her until then came from. The stranger raised his weapon, and the protagonist rushed forward to cover the princess. The blow landed on Ravel's head, and she lost consciousness. Upon opening her eyes, the girl saw an excited Elinea in front of her. The protagonist jumped up and started checking if the princess was okay. Noticing a scratch on her palm, she panicked at the thought of the emperor's fury upon seeing it. Only now did Ravalier realize that they were in a cabin. Her disguise was gone. Obviously, a lot of time had passed, and they were now far from the capital. Ravalier understood that the guards would arrive soon and save the princess. However, she was just about to suggest to Elinea that they wait quietly when she disappeared again. The protagonist saw her rummaging in a corner of the room. A minute later, the princess turned happily to Ravalier and showed her a hole in the wall. The girl tried to stop Elinea and convince her to wait for the knights. But she insisted that they had to escape. She begged her to trust her and assured her that everything would be fine. Understanding that she would have to give in, the protagonist suggested checking if it was safe outside first. However, the princess didn't even listen to Ravalier and was already squeezing through the opening. While the girl tried to convince her to peek out first, footsteps were heard nearby. A male voice complained about what problematic children had been assigned to him. A man with a scar on his face leaned over them, surprised at how stupid Elinea was. The princess covered Ravalier and threatened the criminal that he wouldn't get away with it. But she failed to scare the man, as he was sure that no one would come to help the girls. Ravalier understood that the group was opposed to the emperor, and for the umpteenth time was surprised by the number of enemies he had. According to the man, the emperor was in mortal danger at that moment and perhaps already trapped. Elena's previous confidence immediately vanished from her face, and fear appeared in her eyes. She demanded an explanation of what they intended to do to her father, although the criminal refused to answer. She kept insisting. Unable to bear the provocation any longer, the man violently stomped the wall. He ordered them to return to the cabin for their own safety. He grabbed her hand, and she tried to break free with all her might. Ravalier grabbed the bandit by the arm and immediately demanded that he release the princess. In fact, she feared the girl might get bruises on her hands, as the emperor might accuse her. The man laughed at Ravalier's audacity and threatened to kill her. He advised her to stop underestimating him and, grabbing her dress, lifted her off the ground. The heroine turned towards Elinea and winked at her to flee and bring the emperor. However, the princess didn't move from her spot. She bent down, picked up a stone from the ground, and threw it at the criminal. However, Elinea was clearly not a good shot, as the stone hit Ray Belair directly on the forehead. The girl fainted again and fell to the ground. Her last thought was about why novel protagonists are always so clumsy. So the story returns to the moment when Ray Belair, tied up, lies in one of the cabin's storage crates. She hears the knights entering with the emperor and how they save Helena. The protagonist's mouth is covered. She tries to let them know she is also there, but for some reason no one hears her. While Elinea cries in her father's arms, Ray Belair shakes the crate from inside. The emperor stares at her, but shows no sign of having noticed anything. The moment Liam suggests to his daughter that they return home, Ray Belair understands that they will leave her there. The girl is tired of being a supporting character, after having done everything possible to protect the princess. The maid is informed that they finally found the princess. Upon hearing that they will soon return to the castle with the emperor, Raylia kneels. The other maid asks the knight what happened to Ray Belair. He replies that there is no news about her and that the girl probably didn't survive. The Grand Duke, who is walking in the garden at that moment, is an accidental witness to this conversation. What he hears does not fit in his mind, and the boy cannot believe that Ray Belair has died. His legs carry him alone towards the depths of the dead forest, gradually breaking into a run. The Duke initially thought that Ray Belair was the Emperor's spy, a charming girl of her age sent to monitor his every move. The first time he saw her, he was fascinated by that unusual hair color. The Duke never imagined he would see her again. However, their seemingly casual encounters happened again and again. At some point, he became curious about what future she spoke of, although Ray Belair was in the same situation as the Duke. She hadn't lost hope, and he was intrigued by how far she would go. Arriving running at the field covered in buttercups, the Duke stops. Deep down, he is sure that she couldn't have died. He shouts that he knows they are here, and that he is prepared to fulfill His Majesty's will. In fact, cloaked figures were hiding everywhere, in the trees and behind them. The Duke demanded to be taken immediately before the Emperor. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, Ray Belair tries to free herself from the ropes that are too tight. She finally manages to free her hands. Although she manages to get out of the crate and escape, she has no idea what to do now. After being abandoned, returning to the palace would be humiliating, but hiding is also too dangerous. Just when she thinks she might take a brief rest, someone appears behind her. A woman with a bow and arrows examines Ray Belair with surprise and notes that she has never seen her before. The hunters wonder what a child is doing there, and the protagonist realizes how lucky she is. Invoking her acting talent, with tears in her eyes, she says she was playing hide-and-seek with her mother. And she got lost. The strangers listen to her with compassion. They suggest she stay with them and have dinner until they find her mother. But feeling that it was strange to meet them, Ray Belair decides to remain alert and flee. However, she doesn't manage to maintain vigilance for long, as in front of the bonfire. And dinner, she loses her alertness. Without understanding how she adapted so easily, Ray Belair thinks fleeing will be difficult. Suddenly, the woman offers her hand and warns her of something she hadn't noticed at first. The marks on her face reveal that she has been through many difficulties. The woman promises to go to the village at dawn to ask for her wounds to be healed. Ray Belair decides to rest a little, thinking nothing serious will happen, and thanks the strangers. The protagonist feels overwhelming fatigue, while the people around admire her excellent appetite. The girl calms down, as before dinner she ate a rapier flower just in case. But suddenly, she perceives an astonishing weakness throughout her body. Ray Belair collapses to the ground, with the thought that she trusted those strangers in vain. As she loses consciousness, she hears their goodnight wishes. Crossing his arms over his chest and smiling maliciously, the Emperor asks what could have happened for the Duke to come directly to him. The boy kneels before him and promises to play his part if Liam demands it. He is willing to die for the good of the imperial family. The Duke announces that he will leave for the war. And if he has the opportunity to prove his loyalty, he will undoubtedly look for whoever kidnapped the princess. Jessie lays Ravlet on the bed and worries that the sedative was too strong. Her accomplice Tom accuses the woman of being soft, since not only did she fail in the kidnapping of the princess, but now she worries about someone who might be a spy. The protagonist is actually not asleep and hears everything, so she now understands that these individuals are collaborating with the kidnappers. Kidnappers. Meanwhile, the man and the woman argue that they wouldn't have had to deal with this if the emperor had died. They regret that the prince is not with them and advise Jessie not to get used to the girl and give her more sedatives later. Upon leaving the room, Javier gets up and sits on the bed. Obviously, more people hate the emperor than she thought. If those kidnappers were normal, the protagonist wouldn't even think about collaborating with them. But they are real beginners. Upon approaching the table, Ravier sees a plant they use to make the sedatives. If this herb is made from what she imagines, she could neutralize it with a rapier. The girl puts her hand in her pocket and finds a small bag with flowers. Pouring them into her palm, she realizes why she fell asleep, as all the flowers were dry. Ravier notices a bright butterfly entering through the window, which she thinks she has seen before. Suddenly, the protagonist wonders how she managed to wake up in such a situation. Perhaps she has developed a resistance to poisons after so many tests. Javier lies down on the bed again and covers himself with the blanket. She decides to take advantage of the opportunity to escape as soon as possible. However, she doesn't plan to return to the palace, convinced that no one is truly looking for her. Memories of the Grand Duke appear in her mind. Tears begin to stream from her eyes, as Railber has no idea where to go. 3 days have passed, and during that time, the heroine managed to obtain some information from Tom's conversations. And Jessie's. For example, in this small village gather everyone who lost everything because of the emperor. Knights who fled from the endless imperial campaigns and expelled artisans. Just because Elinea hurt herself stepping on their products. There are many former advisors to the emperor, and Railber thought that among them there must be people who knew her. The heroine decides to leave immediately, as the guard is currently patrolling the other part of the village. She placed a pillow and a blanket on the bed to simulate someone sleeping, and Railber climbs onto the windowsill. However, at that moment Jessie enters, lazily rubbing her eyes. The girl jumps to the floor and hopes the woman doesn't check the bed. Railbert covers her mouth and hears the footsteps approaching. And suddenly, Jessie asks the girl if she is asleep. Realizing she's been discovered, Railbert tries to escape with all her might. Although she doesn't know the way well, she runs towards the forest, hoping to escape pursuit. The heroine decides to hide first. Soon, criminals with torches search for her throughout the forest. Javier hears them commenting that she is a spy, because otherwise, such a powerful sedative couldn't have failed to take effect. While reflecting on how to get out of this situation, the protagonist notices a familiar glow among the grass. She crawls closer and sees the butterfly that entered her room 3 days ago. And the moment she believes the butterfly is calling her, Tom finds Javier. With disdain, he comments that the girl is good at hiding. Tom raises the torch over Javier's head, and she closes her eyes. But when the protagonist opens her eyes, she sees that someone has pierced her pursuer with a sword. As Tom falls, Javier sees him surprised behind him. The Duke. When she asks him how he got here, the boy suddenly remembers that she wanted to know his name. The Duke smiles and replies that his name is Kalakis Benoit Trichin. With tears of joy, Rabier throws herself at the Duke's neck and hugs him tightly. Kalakis gently strokes the girl's face. The knights capture the remaining criminals, tie them up, and advise them not to even try to flee. As they are led away, the protagonist sits on the ground next to the Duke to recover. With eyes swollen from tears, she asks why they went all this way for her. After all, even Sir Eden of the First Order of Knights, upon hearing about the kidnapping, immediately offered to look for her. Kalakis looks at the knight with a tired gaze as he begins to apologize for being late. However, Rebellera happily thanks Eden for helping her. The Duke leans over the girl, reaches out his hand to her face, and calls her by her name. He removes a leaf stuck in her hair, and the protagonist asks His Excellency what happened. However, he frowns and reminds the girl that she told him his name. Only now does Ray Belay understand that Kalakis is jealous and hurries to assure him that he is her only friend. However, the Duke asks that from now on she does not call him that. He wants her to call him by his name and treat him as before. Ray Belay laughs and promises to do so. Sitting by the fire next to Kalakis, the protagonist asks how he got here and why he is wearing knight's clothes. Looking at him closely, she is interested to know if something happened between him and the Emperor. Showing him a crumpled piece of paper, Cassius replies that he did what she advised him. And he told Liam that he was going to war. Ray Belair notices that he is holding the note she left in the book. And now Kalakis asks the girl to tell him the truth. Why participating in the war is the only way for him to survive. The protagonist is not surprised that the Duke wants to know the truth, since she convinced him to enlist in a bloody civil war with allied forces that will last more than 10 years. She didn't really want to send him to such a place, but there was no other option. And Riebler replies that the campaign will be led by Duke Vicella Barry. That's why she wants Kalakis to gain his support, especially since he is the heir to the Trician house. The Duke is interested in knowing how his family is related to Vicella Barry. So the girl tells him about the Armantium, metal deposits in the lands of the Trician house, that the Duke has been searching for years. Riebler advises him to take advantage of this to gain Vicella Barry's trust, and thus win him over to his side. However, the boy is not sure it will work. After a brief silence, the protagonist tells him that people live in that village whose lives the Emperor destroyed. And although most decided to take revenge, wasting their remaining days, they still form families anyway and dream of tomorrow. Riebler places her hand on Kalakis' arm and tells him that they can do it too. She suggests they simply be happy and leave for the sea together. Her words give the boy hope, and he smiles at her, gently stroking Riebler's face. He accepts her proposal. Now he wants to do everything possible to finally be happy. That's why he won't run away anymore. Realizing that she won't be able to hide from the Emperor, the protagonist decides to act differently and integrate perfectly into the palace. So the next day she kneels before the princess. With a determined look, she asks Elaine for forgiveness for not protecting her, even though it was her duty. Just a few hours earlier, sitting in the carriage with Kalakis, Rabel had told him of her decision. She will tell everyone that she tried to protect the princess. In this way, the protagonist plans to ensure that she is treated as she deserves. She believes it is the only way to survive in the palace. After a moment of silence, Kalakis proposes that the girls simply escape together. Because even if the princess acknowledges Rabel's efforts, the Emperor's attitude will not change. Besides, Kalakis feared leaving her alone when he left for the war. He offered to take her anywhere if Rabel wished. But the protagonist knows that they will not be able to hide from the Emperor, no matter how much they try. She thanked Kalakis for his concern, but insisted that, for his own good, he had to return to the palace. The girl affirmed that she doesn't care if her efforts are recognized, even if they are not. She will find another way. She asked the Duke not to worry, and reminded him that from now on they decided to live a full life. Kalakis smiled, thinking that Ray Bilar had always been like this, and he really had nothing to worry about. He understood that now was not the time to cling to his worries. The protagonist called him to the window to admire the sunrise together. Looking at his sword, Kalakis thought he needed to gain enough strength to protect himself. He turned to Ray Belair and asked her to bring more books next time. Kalakis smiled and suggested reading them together. The protagonist laughed and promised to bring a mountain of books. Meanwhile, Elinea received a message from a peacock announcing that Ray Belair was returning. She ran to Raniel with the good news and, with tears of joy in her eyes, told him she was happy the girl was okay. In reality, the princess thought she had killed Ray Belair with that stone. There was so much blood around her, and Elinea had never seen anything like it before. So, upon learning that Ray Belair was still alive, the princess was happy, but also terrified. She feared the girl would hate her and tell everyone that she was to blame for everything. But it seemed there was no reason to worry. Because according to Reveler, who was kneeling, she now lived for her. The princess runs towards the girl and tries to lift her up from her knees. But she resists, without ceasing to blame herself for what happened. Realizing that Reveler holds no grudge, Elena's eyes start to fill with tears. She orders her to stop humiliating herself, because no matter what others say, she is her savior. The princess asks Raniel to bring the gift she had prepared for Reveler. When Elena opens the box, the protagonist is surprised. The princess smiles. She gives Reveler a uniform and proposes that she become her personal maid. According to her, she even spoke to her father so they would forgive her, and the girl thanks her for this. Hugging Reveler, Elena tells her that she will no longer have to be in charge of tasting the food. The protagonist bows and promises to serve the princess with all her heart. Elena feels very satisfied with herself, because now she looks very generous in everyone's eyes. Her mood darkens when she hears the maids' conversation. The maids were impressed that Reveler protected the princess, risking her life. And she suffered no harm. Looking around her, Elena realizes that everyone is talking about that girl. This annoys her, because it was she who saved Reveler, an almost slave, and gave her a normal life. Jealousy and resentment begin to invade the princess. Her thoughts are interrupted by Ravel's words, who bows before Elena and reminds her that it is time for lunch. The girl smiles and affirms that she will never forget the princess's kindness. At that moment, Elena reflects that she is demanding too much of herself, because in this life, everyone admires her anyway. She greets Ravel and wishes her a good rest. Elena believed that no one could take away what belonged to her. However, she began to realize how much attention others paid to Ravel, and how happy they were to see her. Observing from the outside, Elena suddenly wonders, why do her bad premonitions always come true? From the moment, the protagonist tried her best to show her loyalty. Her daily life changed radically. They treated her differently and even assigned her a new room. Ravel was given quality food and dressed in fine clothes. Her reputation also changed considerably, and more people began to trust her. The girl was highly sought after, and everyone asked her for help. But Ravel was partly annoyed, as the princess had given her a day off. And yet, everyone kept coming to her constantly. Now, with a towel in her hand, the protagonist wonders why everyone suddenly rushed her. But she has no other choice, so she obediently cleans her now. Raveler tries to finish all her chores quickly so she can finally rest. Only now does the protagonist realize that the maid has been with her the whole time, and probably heard everything. The surprised maid drops the boxes from her hands and looks closely at the girl. Then she asks if she is really the maid everyone constantly talks about. Grabbing Raveler's surprised hands, she confesses that she is her fan and has wanted to meet her for a long time. Although the protagonist doesn't fully understand what is happening, it is clear that the maid has a good impression of her. The girl hurries to help pick up the fallen boxes. Although the maid is impressed by her kindness, Raveler actually does it to finish this as soon as possible. After collecting all the boxes, the maid leaves. She thanks the girl once more and wishes her a good day. Raveler doesn't remember when the last time someone said something like that to her and decides that from now on, every day will be good for her. If people come to her for help, it means they accept her, and from now on she will strive to do her best. Watching from the balcony, Aline feels anger creeping in. Michelle and Donna ask the princess what caught her attention so much, forcing a calm smile onto her face. Aline replies that she just wanted to get some fresh air. But according to her, the sun turned out to be much brighter than expected. Ribbler's supposed weekly leave comes to an end, and she resumes her duties as a maid. Although even after the job change, the tasks barely changed. Once she sweeps the floor, she must go to the kitchen to check the ingredients and wash the dishes. Suddenly, Miss Tarrant enters, strokes her head, and points out that managing everything must be difficult for her. However, Riveler considers it part of her duties, nothing special. But the woman stares at her so intently that the girl gets the impression she did something wrong. However, Miss Tarrant suddenly announces that she has a proposal for Riveler. And if the girl helps her, she will allow her to take a break after lunch today. The protagonist loves the idea of leaving early and accepts without thinking. Tarrant explains that she needs a model because she must choose an outfit for the princess, who will return late today. She doesn't think Riveler's short stature is an obstacle, as she plans to adjust every detail. The protagonist tries on the wig, although she doubts she placed it correctly. When the girl appears before Tarrant, she is surprised. But Riveler placed it sideways. So the woman suggests she sit down and help her fix it. Lady Tarrant points out that this hair color suits the girl very well, although the pink makes her look more lively and adorable. The woman asks Ravel to wait while she brings the clothes. The protagonist notices a dress sketch on the table and thinks she has seen it before. Ravel is surprised that Tarrant herself cuts and sews dresses for the princess. Seeing the sketch in the girl's hands, the woman says it is just a failed draft. In reality, since childhood, she dreamed of designing dresses for the princess, and now she is finally allowed to do it. That's why the dress design seemed familiar to Ravel, as Miss Tarrant is precisely Elena's personal stylist. In 10 years, she will dictate trends to the entire high society, and as thanks for fulfilling her dream, she promises to tailor only for her. When Rivel read about this, she found it admirable, but now she feels sorry that such talent is dedicated only to one person. She asks if she doesn't want to open her own atelier, although Tyrant replies that she has neither the money nor the talent for that. The protagonist asks her not to be modest, as she is sure that many people will line up to try her designs. Lady Tyrant would be happy if the girl's words came true. And as a token of gratitude, she promises to sew a dress for her. The protagonist is struck by how intensely the eyes of someone motivated shine. The woman hopes that someday, if she really opens an atelier, Rivel will be her first client. Deep down, the girl hopes that someday she can wear such beautiful clothes and live following the call of her heart. Remembering Kalakis, the protagonist feels longing and the desire to see him. A few days pass, and the Duke trains in his castle courtyard. Suddenly, Rebelier comes out of the forest smiling with a basket in her hand. The girl immediately notices that Kalakis has grown due to the training and tells him instantly. Since he needs to eat well, Rebelier offers him a basket of treats. They spread a blanket under the shade of a tree and sit down to eat something. Kalakis is surprised where Rebelier gets so much delicious food from, and the girl tells him that she has become the princess's personal maid. The Duke replies indifferently that he is glad she got what she wanted. Then he announces that the departure date for the war is set, and as if a dark cloud hung over the protagonist. According to Kalakis, he will leave very soon, but he doesn't know the exact day yet. The uncertainty of the day they will have to say goodbye clouds her sadness. However, she tells herself that it is not time to be sad. She gets up and calls the Duke. To his surprise, Rabelar affirms that they must create as many good memories as possible before he leaves. When night falls, the protagonist takes Kalakis to a pond to watch fish, whose scales shimmer with all the colors of the rainbow. Looking at the girl, the Duke comments that it is truly beautiful. For a moment, the protagonist even thinks he is talking about her. Rabelar congratulates herself for having devised such a wonderful pastime. She boasts that she understands him better than he does. And at that moment, Kalakis notices something. Running towards the girl and pushing a strand of hair from her forehead, he asks where the scar came from. Rabelar recounts how, during the kidnapping, the princess accidentally hit her with a rock. However, she instantly realizes this cannot be true, because when she escaped the crate she felt no pain on her forehead. Holding the girl's face with both hands, Kalakis regrets not having noticed sooner. And he worries about the pain she suffered. Feeling that he is too close, Raveler pushes the Duke away, affirming that she is fine. But the protagonist miscalculates her strength, so Kalakis falls directly into the lake. The girl offers him her hand and apologizes, explaining that she got so emotional because he was so close. As she gets closer, she suddenly notices something strange on the Duke's back, and he decides to tell her everything. In Kalakis' memories of warm protection, one episode stands out with greater intensity. The emperor looks at him with a crazy expression because he finally managed to see the true power of the dragon. The little duke, holding his mother's body with his arms, presses against her, while behind him 2 gigantic dragon wings open. The emperor is surprised that the mysterious power transmitted by the first emperor is hidden in Kalakis's miserable body. Tears ran down his face, and he looked at Liam with hatred. The hated emperor stated that the boy apparently had talent, unlike his parents. But since Kalakis could not control it yet, Liam said that he himself would find a use for him. So they imposed a seal on the duke's body that repressed his dragon strength. And he spent 5 years in the north in captivity, moving here recently. Ravel knows that this strength is a great capacity to rule the empire and be loved by all women. And this strength, similar to a temptation, ended up becoming a hell. She approaches the boy and tells him that he is truly very strong. According to Kalakis, it was 5 years ago when he was still a child, but if he survived, then he is truly strong. Rabel takes his hand, places it on his forehead, and tells him that it must have hurt him a lot. Until that moment, Kalakis had always considered his life a period of waiting for his own death. But now it seems to him that that time was the wait for his meeting with Rabel. He hugs her and tells her that everything is fine, that now that belongs to the past. Kalakis feels that from today on, all of that truly belongs to the past, because now he has a reason to live. If he can become someone Ravel can rely on, he also needs to find a path he can walk. And at the end of this path, the one who destroyed everything will die. So now Kalakis is sure that Liam will get what he deserves. Since the wind has become cold, the boy suggests to Rayler that they return, and she follows him, promising to read before sleeping. The next day, at the princess's castle, the maids do not stop praising the heroine's talents in household chores. The girl smiles shyly. Julia apologizes to the girl for having behaved rudely towards her. However, Ryler feels there is no need to apologize, as she remembers how the maid offered her delicious fruits. Taking advantage of the maids being distracted by the conversation, the heroine manages to leave the room without anyone noticing. Everyone praises her so much that sometimes it makes her a little uneasy. Adjusting the curtains, she thinks that now it seems like they no longer hold a grudge against her. Suddenly, Rayler hears the princess's voice behind her, and turning around, she sees that she is sitting at the table. This is the first time they have met since the girl became a maid. The heroine notices that lately Elinea has been troubled by many worries. Rayler approaches the princess and asks why she is pensive. And she confesses that she cannot draft a letter. She hasn't communicated with that person for a long time and wants to know how he is, but feels some discomfort. Upon learning that the letter is for the boy, Rayler understands that it is about Roy, the protagonist with whom Lena started to associate at that age. The princess dreamily tells the girl about how focused, intelligent, and skillful with a sword he is. Javier gives Aline several tips on how to better express her ideas. The princess thanks the girl for helping her and asks Ranel to bring new paper for writing. The protagonist is happy to have helped lift Aline's spirits a bit. The maid hands the paper to the princess and moves Ravier away from her table. She suggests she leave the room so Aline can concentrate. Ranel praises the girl for improving more and more and advises her to continue with the same enthusiasm. Upon hearing this, Aline freezes, forgetting about the letter. She squeezes the envelope angrily and wonders what is so special about Javier. It is her duty to help the princess, but for some reason, even when doing her job, she is praised. Although Lane does not want to think badly, sometimes she wishes Javier would disappear. Since she first had these thoughts, she hasn't felt well. She leans back in the chair and thinks how repulsive she is. She yelled at him for nonsense and was in a bad mood afterwards. The princess made a firm decision that this cannot continue, as it is her responsibility to that girl. She picks up a vase of flowers and tries to apologize and finally rid herself of that bothersome feeling. Elinea leaves the room, but stops upon hearing the voices of the maids. They tell her not to worry so much and say that no one can be perfect. The girl replies that it's okay, but she fears the princess feels uncomfortable because of her incompetence. One of the maids strokes her head and tells her that Raveler is smart, and that she still has a lot to learn. Hearing this, the princess feels fury again. She doesn't understand why everyone wants to take an example not from her, but from that rebel. In a fit of rage, the princess throws the vase to the floor. Hearing the sound of the broken glass, the maids turn around. Peeking through the door, they are surprised to find the princess there. The maids run towards her to make sure she hasn't cut herself. The princess's tears slip down her cheeks as she realizes she broke the vase to get attention. Unable to bear it for another second, the princess flees, shouting that she needs to rest. To tire, stopping in the hallway, she wonders how everything comes so easily to Raveler, when she herself had to give everything. To gain attention, praise, and even her father's love, the princess had to adapt. Calculate and guess. The princess trembles with indignation, and the emperor watches her like this. The emperor asks his daughter what happened, and she throws herself into his arms. Liam hugs her, but she keeps insisting she is fine. The emperor hears that Raveler is trying to locate Elinea, and deduces that she is the one who caused it. Smiling maliciously, he suggests to his daughter that everything will be fixed. The princess looks at him surprised, and he assures her that he will do whatever it takes. If that pleases Elinea, he will send Raveler to the mines or lock her up in an abandoned palace. He suggests simply sending her away or adopting her as a prize. For the sake of his daughter, Liam will do what is necessary. Elinea, seeing who always supports her, asks him to act that way. She will be sent far away for adoption. That way, both girls will be happy. A week later, at the aristocratic academy, the emperor announces to his inner circle that a girl saved the princess. As a reward, she will be given a new family chosen by Elinea. The emperor asks those who wish to be chosen to raise their hands. Since the royal family supports the adoption, the gathered nobility considers it an opportunity. That's why a forest of hands rises, and everyone tries to shout louder than the other. The emperor thought no one would show up, so now he sighs with relief. Elinea reflects on whom would be best to choose as a new father for Raveler. That nobleman's domains are only a day's journey from the capital. It takes half a day to reach that marquee, and the count has lands on the plain with good communications. Elinea wonders if there isn't some family that lives further away from the imperial palace. Suddenly, her gaze falls on the Tiger Man, whose domains are distant and who has no children. Convinced that Raveler will be able to live peacefully, Elinea points her finger at him. Duke Vichalabri, sitting next to the nobleman, notices it. Without changing his expression, he nudges the Tiger Man and stands between them. Just as Elinea announces her choice, her finger points directly at the Duke. Only now does the princess understand what just happened. Vichalabri bows and declares that he will take the girl, as the princess has decided so. He gives Elinea a broad smile, who doesn't understand why the Duke is at this meeting. The emperor confirms with his daughter if she indeed pointed to that person. The princess panics and doesn't know how to answer, because if she changes her mind now about the Tiger Man, who clearly cannot be her father, everyone will be disappointed in her. So Elinea, hiding her face, confirms that her choice is Duke Vichalabri. Thus, he becomes her adoptive father and thanks the emperor for the honor bestowed. The princess consoles herself by thinking that her goal was to send Raveler as far away as possible. And the Duke's lands are very far from the capital. However, Elinea is worried that Royan lives there. But she hopes that, due to the adoption, little will change, and that it will be the best decision for both Raveler and herself. The protagonist was busy with her daily chores when Raniel suddenly informs her that the emperor is calling her. The girl also learns from the maid that Duke Vichalabri has adopted her. Raveler understands nothing of what is happening, as she had tried hard not to have any relationship with him. And now this happens. The protagonist does not understand if perhaps she did not adapt well to the palace, and her plan failed. Raniel is convinced that this is great news, as the girl needs a family, and suggests she pack her things after the audience, as the Duke wants to take her away today. Raveler cannot believe she is leaving just like that for a family where the son intends to kill his own father. It seems to the girl that she had just started to feel at home there, and now she must start everything from scratch. Ray Bell enters the throne room, where the emperor awaits her. Seeing the girl, he states that he does not trust her, even though she assures him she is loyal to the princess. She knows she cannot show weakness in this situation. The protagonist asks what she must do for them to believe her. The emperor notes that this girl does not lack courage and crosses his fingers. According to him, there is only one way Raveler can earn his trust. The aide opens a chest, and the protagonist sees vials with some potion inside. The emperor offers her two options: sacrifice her life or inform him about everything in Bichellebury. If she is sure she can handle this, Raveler must drink this poison. Although there is an antidote in the chest that will not completely cure her. The protagonist understands that this way, Liam plans to keep her under his control until death. She now regrets telling the Duke about the sorcerer. Raveler stands up, takes one of the vials, and drinks its contents with determination. Her neck spasms. It is difficult for her to breathe. The girl reaches out her hand towards the second vial. Locating the antidote, Raveler empties the second bottle too. Liam warns her to be careful if she doesn't want to disappear, as she is not the only spy in the Duke's house. Kneeling down, the protagonist promises the emperor that she will remember it. Deep in her heart, she hopes to take revenge on him if she ever gains strength. A few hours later, Raveler, with unbearable stomach pain, decides to leave the castle. She managed to say goodbye to the maids while they loaded her belongings onto the cart. However, it seems strange to the protagonist to leave just like that, as if the current was carrying her. But even if she hasn't made any decision, she cannot just leave like that. The protagonist scans the Duke's subjects and the Duke himself, who awaits her by the cart. The butler is about to accompany Raveler, but she asks him to wait a moment. The girl approaches Wieslaberry and greets him. First of all, she thanks the Duke for accepting her into his family. Then Raveler asks him if it is not inappropriate to grant her a little time before leaving. She knows there won't be another chance, and mentions that there is a friend she wants to say goodbye to. The girl bows before the Duke and asks him to show mercy. But Wieslaberry suddenly replies that there is no need to mention mercy, because from now on Raveler is his daughter. Then he adds that if the girl refers to the Great Duke, he has already left. The protagonist cannot believe what she hears, and Wieslaberry repeats that if it is about that boy. He went on an expedition today. Raveler understands that Calaquis lied when he said he didn't know the exact date. The girl runs away, and the Duke's servants rush after her. Wieslaberry watches her silently as she leaves and recalls the previous night. That child came to him, approaching stealthily from behind. However, the Duke recognized the boy immediately by his red eyes. Since there was no need for introductions, Calaquis stated that this would simplify the conversation. He got straight to the point and announced that the next day he would declare war on the Allied states. Then the boy unexpectedly asked to be saved. In return, he promised to give the Duke the same adamantium silver he had been searching for a long time. When asked where he got this information, he replied that the only relevant thing was that he could be useful. Furthermore, he recalled that he was the true heir to the imperial blood, something so necessary for Wieslaberry. The Duke found it arrogant to emphasize his legitimate blood in front of someone who had been called the imperial family's dog his whole life. But if that child fights so hard to cling to life, it means he will survive. Just like that girl. Therefore, Bichellebury pointed out that Felicity likes to meddle in matters that do not concern her. According to him, the emperor could not leave people like them unsupervised. But Calaquis looked away and said he didn't understand what it was about. The Duke, while adjusting his cuffs, reported that every 3 days at 5 in the morning, a convoy with military supplies arrives. He handed Calaquis his wrist pin, which he must show to the convoy. And if he manages to survive until that moment, he will live. The boy asked if Bichellebury was helping him because he is Raveler's friend. The Duke replied that it was one of the reasons. He doesn't understand what children like them could be guilty of. Bichellebury stroked his head and added that he was only doing his duty, like any adult. But the boy knew perfectly well that helping him meant open treason to the emperor. At dawn, the great duke was informed that it was time to leave, while he stood by his parents' grave. Kalakis gets up immediately, as he is ready for the journey. Leaving a bouquet of rapier flowers on the grave, the boy sets off. He knows he cannot fully trust the duke's words, as anyone can say nice things. Before Kalakis can take a few steps, he hears a familiar voice calling him from behind. Raveler, breathing heavily, runs towards him and starts yelling at the boy. She hits him hard and calls him stupid. The heroine is furious to know how he could leave without saying goodbye, when clearly they are not strangers to each other. Raveler, crying profusely, affirms that even being adopted, she came to say goodbye. Kalakis admits that he simply didn't know how to tell her, and that's why he sent a letter to the palace. The girl received it, and therefore doesn't understand how he could write something like that simply in a letter. She hands the boy her note and affirms that she still hasn't forgiven him. That's why he must return alive to fulfill his promise. Kalakis glances at the message, in which he proposed to Raveler to go see the sea together when he returned. At the bottom, the girl wrote that he was foolish and that she hated him. The duke laughed and promised to keep his promise. He thanks Raveler, who wishes him a good trip, and they hug tightly. After saying goodbye to Kalakis, the protagonist heads to Duke Vichelaberi's capital residence. She could not imagine that they would have to say goodbye so soon. Raveler is sure she will make it, but she can't stop worrying about him. Finally, the carriage arrives at the Duke's residence. Upon getting out, the girl worries about what her life will be like now that they simply adopted her into the protagonist's family. Ray fears that, just like in the palace, she will have to fight simply to survive, because she is tired of fighting. However, upon entering the residence, the servants surprisingly receive her kindly. Everyone greets Ray, offers her help, food, and rest after the journey. The heroine cannot believe she is greeted with such joy. Sitting on the bed, she watches as the servants distribute her belongings in her rooms. The girl no longer remembers what it's like to be small. The maid suddenly asks if there is too much noise, but Ray doesn't understand her question. The servant explains that they learned about the adoption at the last minute and didn't have time to prepare many things. According to her, everything is strictly organized in Vichelaberi. And until now, they had only seen the backs of the Duke and the young master. Now they cannot help but admire their mistress, a doll sweet as honey. Realizing this, the maid remembers that she didn't introduce herself. She says her name is Charlotte, and she will be Raveler's personal maid. Amazed by her energy, the girl replies that she is happy to meet Charlotte and hopes to get along well with her. Pushing the aide out of the room, the young woman lets Raveler rest and promises to visit her tomorrow morning. After seeing them off, the heroine feels the first worry leaving her, as clearly she won't have to live constantly alert here. Inspecting the boxes, she cannot remember having had so many belongings. Suddenly, the girl's attention is fixed on a small chest. She cannot recall if she has seen it before. Upon opening the box, Raveler is petrified with astonishment. Inside, there is an antidote. Proof of the Emperor's blackmail. It means that Liam is always watching Raveler from everywhere. The girl is happy to have met Kayakis before leaving. Now she has a small pouch with rapier flowers. Without thinking twice, the protagonist drinks the contents of the bottle. Although she has the flowers, for now Raveler plans to rely on this antidote. Otherwise, if she recovers quickly, Liam will realize everything. Now she has to solve the following. She must find the Emperor's spy, survive in the distant residence, and avoid meeting the protagonist who caused everything. She is not sure if it was right to stay in this house. But for now, Raveler decides to sleep a little and then think about the rest. Because today was a very exhausting day. The next day, the girl wakes up with a terrible flu. Seeing her condition, the Duke orders Charlotte to call a doctor. However, the protagonist cannot allow it to be revealed that she ingested the poison. Otherwise, she could face death. That's why she tries to convince the Duke that it's excessive and that she only recently ate poisoned food from the princess. Although Raveler claims the fever is due to the antidote, Michelle Avery doesn't understand what potion causes such an ailment. She asks her not to insist on ignoring it, as her immunity is weakened and finding a treatment is crucial. However, the protagonist keeps insisting that she is perfectly fine. But the Duke knows that Felicity is too smart to insist without a reason. Suddenly, he sits next to her on the bed and places her head on his knees. Raveler is surprised that Vicella Barry suddenly mentions something someone said: that his daughter is more fragile than glass. Before her eyes appears the image of her father, who, while bandaging a wound, told her that she was fragile as glass. And that hurt him. Vicella Barry covers her eyes with his hand and suggests she sleep a little. Meanwhile, at the fencing academy, the young Vicella Barry trains on the track. The messenger apologizes for interrupting his practice. He informs him that an urgent message has arrived from the Duke. Adjusting his messy hair, Royan asks about the content. After hesitating for a moment, the messenger reveals that the Duke adopted the girl. Royan stops, trying to process what he heard.